Health and Human Services, education-related agencies will come to order. Secretary Acosta, we're certainly glad you're here with us today to talk about the Department of Labor's request. I know you're in the last month of your first year, and I will say I think your work at the department's made a big difference. We've actually now confirmed one person of the nominees that have been appointed to come and help you at the confirmed level, and hopefully we can do more of that before long. But your ability to deal with the process, to insist on timing that makes sense, I know is appreciated by me and our committee. The president must also think you're doing a great job, because he thinks you can do it with 11% less money next year than you had last year, and we'll see how that goes. But we look forward to your testimony, to your discussion of your priorities, new proposals that you've seen in the last year that will make a difference at the department. Certainly the economic news, the strength of the economy, the strength of the unemployment numbers, and even the better, obviously, employment numbers. 4.1% unemployment is the lowest in 17 years, but I think we all should continue to be concerned that many Americans are still underemployed, and many Americans have just simply given up on looking for work. We're going to turn to you for ways we can deal with that in a better way, and also your views on how we can prepare a workforce for the jobs that are likely to be out there. And I know we've had discussions in the past about looking at our assistance in things besides just traditional higher education, but in energy and healthcare, in food. There are obvious areas of growth that are going to be out there in our economy, and we want to be sure we have a skilled workforce that has the skills necessary for the jobs that are going to be there. I think regulation was overreaching in the last several years, and your efforts to look at the regulations that are out there and to see what needs to be done about them are appreciated by me, and I think our whole committee is more than willing to look at you and look at those regulations, work with you to eliminate regulations that provide little benefit or no benefit, and maybe stand in the way of people having the kinds of jobs, the good-paying jobs they'd like to have. Response to the tax bill, at least where I live, has been very good, and I think it's been very good in the country. A number of companies, big and small, moving forward. Last week near my hometown in Springfield, Missouri, I was looking at a solar company that just announced they were going to add 30 jobs and expand their operations in both Springfield and Kansas City. Another company, Mid-Am Metal Formings, has 140 employees in Rogersville, Missouri. They all will receive a cash benefit bonus this year, and I think when you talk to those employers, it's in anticipation of maintaining a great workforce in a growing economy, and we want to continue to see that, whether in Missouri it's Walmart or Boeing or that 140 employee company in Rogersville, Missouri. Those things are happening. So we're glad you're here to talk about what we can do to prepare workers for higher skilled jobs, to help those who've lost their jobs get back on their feet, to protect workers' rights and benefits, and to support a safe and productive workplace. And glad to be joined by my partner in this effort, Senator Murray. And Senator Murray, let's go to you for your opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Blunt. Welcome, Secretary Acosta. Good to have you here today. At the outset, I do want to express my hope that Republicans and Democrats will come together to reject this budget, President Trump's fiscal year 2019 budget, just as we rejected the deep cuts that were proposed to workforce programs in his 2018 budget, which is a clear signal of the bipartisan support we have here for those investments. And I also hope Republicans will stand with Democrats in vigorously opposing any effort to undo the 2018 omnibus bill we passed and the President signed only this month. Because frankly, this budget in front of us shows just how far apart the Trump administration's priorities are from what Congress just agreed on and sent to the President. President Trump, it seems, is willing to explode our debt and deficit to give billionaires and corporations a massive tax giveaway, all the while gutting programs working families rely on to get ahead. We've all seen the tweets and heard the rhetoric about President Trump's promise to put workers first, yet the reality is this budget proposes to cut high-quality workforce training programs that help our workers get good jobs and improve the efficiency of businesses and grow our economy. Connecting workers to good jobs and employers to a skilled workforce has been the Department of Labor's central mission for decades. Yet this budget proposes more than $1 billion in cuts to the department's employment and training programs. Mr. Secretary, the President's budget would mean that millions of workers, including dislocated coal miners and veterans, could lose access to these critical services next year. The Department's own data shows that more than 5 million private sector jobs were unfilled at the start of this year. If the administration was serious about its commitment to our country's workforce, it would strive to get that number as low as possible instead of its deficit-busting drive to reduce the corporate tax rate. Mr. Secretary, you know the Registered Apprenticeship Program is a top priority of mine, which is why I'm very pleased we were able to increase the funding by over 50% in the 2018 omnibus. Yet I do remain greatly concerned about the administration's efforts to weaken the program by attempting to create a duplicative, non-registered program that would allow unqualified for-profits and business groups to certify unaccountable, low-wage, and lower-quality apprenticeships. The 2018 omnibus is clear. The funding provided is for expanding registered apprenticeship opportunities. Evidence clearly shows that over 90% of apprentices are employed after completing these programs with starting wages above $60,000. And for every dollar spent on apprenticeships, employers get an average of $1.47 back in increased productivity and greater frontline innovation. It is critical that federal dollars are focused where there is strong evidence and a return on investment, rather than on duplicative systems that do not guarantee quality training and provide fewer safeguards for workers and employers. And the budget not only fails to adequately invest in the skills of our workforce, it also falls short of what is needed to ensure workers receive the protection of our labor laws that make sure workers have fundamental rights at work, including the right to a fair day's pay for a hard day's work and a right to a safe workplace. Mr. Secretary, I am glad we were able to work together to come to an agreement after your department proposed a rule that would have allowed employers to steal workers' tips, and I appreciate your work on that. But I'm still concerned the Wage and Hour Division is understaffed, making it unable to fully enforce important protections, including the new protection for workers' tips, equal pay protections, leave protected under the Family and Medical Leave Act, and more. The Department's Women's Bureau also plays a critical role with respect to gender-based pay discrimination, paid leave, protection for workers who are pregnant, and so many other critical issues for working women. Unfortunately, this budget inexplicably slashes the Bureau's funding 74% below the level we provided for the current year. And finally, I'm troubled the administration is using this budget to advance the Trump Care agenda, proposing an association health plan rule that will allow fly-by-night operators to sell junk coverage that comply with consumer protections, that further undermining families' health care and raising costs for people with pre-existing conditions. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for this opportunity today. I look forward to working with you to continue our practice over the last 2 years of rejecting devastating cuts and continuing needed investments in programs that both train and protect our nation's workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Murray. And Secretary Costa, we're pleased to have you here today. And if you'd like to start with an opening statement, this would be a good time to do that.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Murray, thank you for your opening statements. Members of the subcommittee, thank you for being here. I'm pleased to appear before you to discuss the important work of the Department of Labor and its proposed budget for the upcoming fiscal year. In its first year, the Trump administration delivered strong opportunities for American workers, American job seekers, and American job creators. And at the department, 2017 was also a busy and productive year. And I'd like to offer some data, if I could. The Employment Benefits Security Administration, EBSA, recovered nearly $700 million in enforcement actions, obtained 93 criminal indictments, and recovered an additional $437 million on behalf of nearly 400,000 plan participants and beneficiaries. The Mine Safety and Health Administration fulfilled fully its statutory mandate to inspect all underground mines 4 times per year and all surface mines 2 times per year, and combined with additional non-mandatory inspections, conducted more than 40,000, actually nearly 43,000 inspections. OSHA conducted nearly 32,000 inspections. And that's a particularly important figure because 2017 marked the first time in 5 years that inspections increased year over year, despite suspension of enforcement for short periods of time in certain regions during hurricane recovery efforts. The Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs obtained more than $30 million in monetary remedies for more than 17,000 job seekers and employees, an average of about $1,700 per person, and reached the largest pay discrimination settlement in more than a decade. A corporation agreed to pay $5 million in back wages and interest to settle allegations of discrimination against 300 women. The Office of Labor Management Standards, OLMS, investigated 121 union officer elections after complaints of violations, conducted 265 criminal investigations, and recorded 82 indictments. The Office of Workers' Compensation Programs implemented aggressive program integrity and pharmaceutical cost control measures that resulted in paying $221 million less in payments than in 2016 as a result of the Office of Workers' Compensation Programs' program integrity efforts. The Wage and Hour Division recovered more than $269 million in back wages for more than 241,000 employees, an average of about $1,100 per employee, and conducted more than 29,000 cases. And the department looks forward to an equally productive year in 2018. I'd like to highlight a few programs in particular. With respect to mine operators, most mine operators are serious about safety and remedy issues when they arise. However, some mine operators have chosen not to pay their fines. And so we did an audit, and we discovered that there's $67 million in unpaid fines at MSHA that have accrued since 2007. Now, Americans know when they get a parking ticket, they need to pay their fine. The fact that for the last several years these mining operators were not paying their fines, I think, is deeply troubling. And so we have started a program in the last several weeks that focuses with particularity on these unpaid fines, and we will begin legal action against them. We've notified them, we expect them paid, and we'll begin legal action against them if needed. With respect to the Wage and Hour Division, we've reinstituted opinion letters. The department is committed to providing meaningful compliance assistance to help employees understand their rights and ensure that employers have the tools necessary to comply with the law. Americans want to know, what does the law mean? And opinion letters for decades did exactly that. It told them this is what the law means. And so we've reinstituted the opinion letter program. I want to touch briefly on occupational licensing. And I've had conversations with several members of the committee about this. Today we announced a $7.5 million grant, or request actually for a proposal to issue grants to fund state reviews and of occupational licensing. And one of the points that we made in the release is that we don't just want a review, we want a plan of action as to how states are going to address this issue. We're not looking for another report. Report after report, this is a bipartisan issue, says occupational licensing is a problem. A study by a scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank estimated a loss of 1.6 million jobs. Brookings said that number is wrong. It's actually closer to 3 million jobs. It's something that needs to be addressed, and unfortunately, what I see a lot of are studies. And so hopefully this is seed money that can encourage states to come up with specific plans of action to address occupational licensing. It's a very important issue. And finally, I want to acknowledge and thank Ranking Member Murray and others on leadership on both sides of the aisle for working to pass what I really think is a win-win bipartisan solution to the tip credit issue that arose. From our perspective, it is a win. I think from the other aisle's perspective, it is a win. And that's, if we can communicate and talk, often we find solutions. And I think that is a great outcome and perhaps a model of the way that things could proceed. And so I look forward to your questions, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Secretary. We'll have time for more than one round of questions, but let's try to restrict ourselves to the 5-minute frame, and then everybody gets a chance to ask their questions and ask second ones if they'd like to. So pleased that you're here again. Let me say that. I did notice in the budget that the enforcement programs were the programs that consistently appeared to have an increase in the request. The wage and hour you've mentioned already, the OSHA has been mentioned, the Office of Labor Management Standards, and compliance on Employee Retirement Income Security Act. Would you talk a little bit about why those particular areas are areas where even your initial request in a budget that's significantly below what you're spending this year would be more money than you had this year?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. As you mentioned, the enforcement agencies in general are at the prior level or slight increases from the prior level. And that's, because I think those are priorities. I spent my opening 5 minutes going through the various statistics from the enforcement agencies, and that was an intentional decision to make the point that we are enforcing these laws, that these laws matter. They've been passed by Congress. They are the laws of the land. They need to be enforced, and the men and women at the Department of Labor need the resources to enforce them. Over time, even if budgets remain flat, life gets more expensive, and so we've asked for slight increases to continue the efforts that I think we've done this year, because, as I said, enforcement matters.
Well, I think your request shows that, and the numbers you've shared with us today also show that your enforcement efforts are higher than they are at a higher level than they have been. Now, as Senator Murray mentioned, we increased in the omnibus bill, increased the apprenticeship funding by 53%, from $95 million to $145 million. Here's an area where you're asking for another significant increase beyond that. I think your request is $200 million, which would be 100% higher than it was in the year we just completed. I think this is one of the areas that the administration has led on, and I think there's still ways to expand both access to these programs and even potentially expanding Pell Grants and other things that would allow the right kind of certified program to be one of the other alternatives for higher education. But here you've got a program you're suggesting we would double year over year. I think we ought to probably hear about that doubling.
Mr. Chairman, you're correct. And first, let me say we very much appreciate the 50% increase that was in this year's budget, just recently approved as part of the omnibus. And in the budget that was submitted, actually requested an even greater increase for the upcoming fiscal year. And as the ranking member pointed out, the apprenticeship model works, and we want to ensure that we have high quality apprenticeships, whether it's the registered apprenticeship program that will continue, and Congress has funded and fully funded, and that money will continue to go out, whether it's the industry recognized apprenticeship that has a fundamentally different structure. On-the-job learning works. All the research shows that is one of the best ways to provide job skills. And it's not just about providing job skills. One of the things that apprenticeships do is it provides a career path. It provides stackable credentials. It's not simply saying, here, you have a skill, you go have a job. But it provides, you come in at level 1, and then you can proceed to level 2, to level 3, to level 4, through a series of stackable credentials of lifelong learning. And I think that type of on-the-job training is something that we need to engage in much more of. As the chairman noted, related to that is our various recommendations in the administration's infrastructure proposal. One of those has to do with Pell, and I think the the Pell recommendation is related, where we have proposed to extend Pell funding from the degree programs. Currently, you need to have Pell, to be Pell eligible, you need to have a program that is 600 hours or more, to certificate programs. And so here's the reason behind that. If a community college has a great program that provides the skills for someone to get a certificate and then go work and continue on the job training while they're working and maybe complete their degree later, why should Pell not be available for those certificate programs? And so, as the chairman mentioned, we believe that's important as well.
And your next step on that would be to work with the Department of Education, to work with the authorizing committee. What do you have in mind to move in that direction?
So Mr. Chairman, in the President's infrastructure, there are three labor-related, and they're both labor and education-related proposals that are in the President's infrastructure plan. One of those has to do with Pell, and the proposal in the infrastructure plan is to extend Pell from the 600-hour requirement that's currently in place to certificate programs. The second has to do with Perkins CTE and to provide additional access at the high school level for Perkins CTE money. And the third is budget neutral. It has to do with the work-study formula. And because the work-study formula right now is the key phrase is hold harmless. It's distributed, and then when additional monies come out, the additional monies are distributed. The universities that received work-study many, many years ago have a disproportionately large percentage of the work-study money. And so the President's infrastructure proposal suggests using the current distribution of Pell money as a framework to distribute work-study money in a way that provides students at some of the newer institutions, some of the community colleges that, in our opinion, have the greatest need, greater access to that work-study money.
Mm-hmm. We've got the chairman and the ranking member of the authorizing committee sitting on either side of me, too, so we can do some double duty here today. And
I couldn't help but notice.
I'm sure you did. Senator Murray.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Costa, as I said, providing workers with the skills that they need to succeed in the economy today is one of the smartest investments we can make to grow our economy. So I'm really pleased that you recently committed to continuing the Apprenticeship USA grants with the funding that Congress provided in 2017. It's why, as we talked about, Chairman Blunt and I agreed to significantly increase the funding for registered apprenticeships in the 2018 omnibus. But I have to say I am deeply concerned about the administration's continued efforts to create a duplicative, non-registered program, especially as you use the burden on corporations as an excuse. I've actually heard from quite the opposite. From employers across multiple industries, including Microsoft, which is in my home state of Washington. And Microsoft recently said, and I quote, "A nationally registered apprenticeship is an essential tool to create a talent ecosystem for our industry." I wanted to ask you, in your apprenticeship task force meeting this week, you indicated the apprenticeship funding Congress appropriated in the 2018 omnibus can only be used to support and expand registered apprenticeship programs. Will you confirm that for the record?
Ranking Member Murray, I'm happy to confirm that. That we can look up the statute. That's what Congress wrote.
Right, correct. And what your budget says. So I just wanted to make sure we were all clear on that. That is,
and that's what I said at the public meeting, because I wanted to make sure that the task force fully understood that, because I wasn't sure if they did.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask you another question. As more women and men come forward with stories about workplace sexual harassment, it's clear that it's well past time for action here. And I want to thank you for your response to my letter on the steps DOL is taking to address workplace harassment within the department. Now, you also indicated the department is finalizing online training for all contractors and employees that emphasizes the ban on retaliation, which is so important given this is the top reason workers do not report harassment. In addition to those steps, I really urge you to consider the department's role in ending harassment in workplaces across the country. And wanted to ask you today, give me like 2 concrete steps the department can take to ensure all workplaces are free from harassment.
Well, Senator Murray, thank you for the question. And as you indicated, we're taking it very seriously. We've had mandatory training of all managers within the department.
Yeah.
We're working on online tools, and certainly the Women's Bureau is looking at this issue very closely, and I will be working with them to address this. I'm also happy to work with this committee. Ultimately, I think, the department. The department implements the laws of Congress and enforces those laws. We can certainly provide information. We can provide online training tools. We can provide data. We can encourage. We can exhort. To the extent that there are legislative changes, those changes would have to come from Congress.
Right. Well, what I'm worried about is that we are not focused on a lot of industries where there isn't the famous person talking about it, but a lot of people who, especially in lower wage jobs, who don't have the kind of voice. And I'm urging your department to do what you can to raise that issue and make people aware that we're watching.
Senator, you mentioned retaliation and whistleblower protections, right, and those are both issues that I think are of paramount importance. Enforcing retaliation provisions, this goes back to my point, and they're already in place. Enforcing those vigorously is very important, and enforcing whistleblower provisions. We recently obtained, I believe it was the largest whistleblower, I'm pulling on memory here, but I believe it was one of the largest whistleblower, if not the largest whistleblower settlement ever as part of one of our whistleblower actions. So that's something that I take very seriously.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I did want to draw your attention that in January, 21 senators and I sent you a letter asking you to study the economic impacts of workplace harassment and really urging you to collect data on the prevalence and cost of sexual harassment so that we can better address the problem, and want to make sure you're aware of that and are looking at how you can collect data.
Senator, I am aware of that. The letter was directed to BLS, that is the entity that collects that data. And they are aware of it. We are very careful in how we direct the Bureau of Labor Statistics for obvious reasons. It is important that those statistical agencies that collect data have some degree of protection and insularity from the political process. But I'm aware of the data. BLS is aware of the data. I believe BLS of the request. I believe BLS already sent a response. And if they haven't sent a response, that should be arriving shortly.
Okay.
I'm aware of the response, which is why I thought it might have been sent.
Okay. All right. We'll be watching for that. Thank you very much.
And Senator, if I could, I just confirmed it was the largest whistleblower case ever, and the response has now been sent. So it is somewhere between our department and your office.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Senator Alexander, then followed by Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, I want to use my 5 minutes to talk about the Tennessee plumber who's making $60,000 or $70,000 and paying $20,000 for health insurance, or the farmer named Marty who came up to me in a Chick-fil-A and said my monthly premium was $300 a month and now it's $1,300 a month. It has gone up under Obamacare that much. I could spend the whole 5 minutes talking about my disappointment that we could not agree on our proposal supported by the President and Senator McConnell and Speaker Ryan to reduce those premiums by up to 40%, according to independent experts. That would have meant a $20,000 premium could have gone down to $12,000 over 3 years. I think we've now conclusively proved that Democrats and Republicans can't agree on changing a single sentence of the Affordable Care Act. But you appear to have found a solution, and I want to make sure I understand it, with your proposal for associated health plans. Now, the plumber and the farmer are part of 9 million Americans who aren't eligible for subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. So they're in what we call the individual market. People who are in Medicare and Medicaid get some government subsidy. More than half of Americans get their insurance on the job from employers, and my figures show that the subsidy they get is about $5,000 a person, because in general, spending by the employer or employee on employee insurance is exempt from income or payroll taxes. Does that sound about right to you?
Senator, those strike me as reasonable numbers.
So the difference between someone who gets insurance at IBM and someone who's self-employed and paying for their own without subsidy starts out with a roughly $5,000 cost differential. So we could lower the cost of health insurance by $5,000 if we could find a way to make more of the small business people or self-employed people, the farmer and the plumber, eligible for the same kind of insurance that large group people have. I assume that's your objective.
Senator, that is the objective. We have what we call small group plans.
Now, let me go a little more rapidly because I've only got 2.5 minutes. What we're not talking about are the short-term limited duration insurance plans. That's something else, right?
Something else.
We're talking about giving small employees of smaller businesses the same kind of insurance coverage large employees of large businesses get.
That is correct.
That would mean local bakeries from Nashville or Phoenix could band together, or Uber or Lyft drivers could band together and get the same kind of coverage that employees at IBM or Walmart enjoy. Mr. Secretary, would the new protections afforded by the Affordable Care Act for the large group market, the Walmart, IBM people, apply to the associated health plans you propose?
Senator, the association of health plans as proposed would be in the large group market. Therefore, the answer was the protections of the large group market.
Give me a shorter answer
Yes.
as you can. Just as under the large group market, an association health plan would be banned from charging patients higher premiums because of a pre-existing health condition, yes or no?
That is correct.
Just as under the large group market, an association health plan would not be allowed to ban or deny coverage of a pre-existing health condition.
As proposed, that is correct.
Just as under the large group market, an association health plan would be required to offer coverage to dependent children up to age 26.
As proposed, that
Just as under the large group market, an association health plan could not cancel an employee's plan because the employee got sick.
As proposed, that is correct.
Just as under the large group market, an association health plan cannot place a ban on annual or lifetime limits or benefit coverage.
As proposed, that is correct.
Just as under the large group market, an association health plan must provide coverage of preventive health services free of charge to the patient. Is that correct?
As proposed, that is correct.
So, in effect, your proposed rule would give the same opportunities and provide the same protections to self-employed Americans and Americans working for small businesses that are available to people with coverage from large employers today.
Senator, that is the crux of the proposed rule.
So I could say to the plumber and to the small farmer in Tennessee that if they could, under the terms of your rule, associate with others in the similar professions and meet those qualifications, that they could buy the same sort of insurance with the same protections and at the same cost advantage that the IBM or Walmart or large group employee of a large group has today. In other words, the small percentage of people in the individual market who pay their own way, the 9 million Americans, would have the same kind of health care that 160 million Americans have in large group employer insurance.
Senator, as you pointed out, may I answer, Mr. Chairman? I noticed, as you pointed out, the theme of the proposal, with the appropriate caveats that this is a proposal and not yet final, the theme of the proposal is we have small group plans and large group plans. And within the small group market, there are a number of Americans that don't even have health care because the small business that they work for does not provide health care. So by associating together, they would have access to the large group market. So the employees of the small business would have access to the same market as the employees of Microsoft or any other large corporation, with all the same protections that are afforded those employees.
And the cost advantage as well.
The cost and the cost advantage, which is quite significant between the large group and the small group market.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to say to my good friend from Tennessee, Senator Alexander, I was one of the 12 Democratic co-sponsors, along with 12 Republican co-sponsors, for a major fix on health care. And I got to be honest with you, I'm befuddled why we haven't done it, why we haven't come to an agreement, because I thought we were moving in the most progressive. I'm a small business person, so I'm very much concerned. It would be very helpful for my family and all the families I work with to have health care that everyone can benefit by. So doors open. I'm ready to go again, sir. You had wonderful meetings. You brought us all together. I'd like for that to happen again. With that being said, I want to go to the Miners Protection Act. The miners in West Virginia and all over this country have done the heavy lifting for our country, given us the country we have today, and I'm very proud. I know Senator Capito and I have co-sponsored many bills to help the mining profession, if you will, and the miners who've sacrificed. The Miners Pension Plan has over 86,000 miners involved. We have 26,000 West Virginians. By 2022, it goes down, as you know. And, sir, only thing I can tell you, it's going to be a horrible situation because the average coal miner, or most of them are widows, who are receiving these pensions only $595 a month. And that means the difference between do they make some payments, do they have any quality of care or a home or not. So we're sure asking for your involvement in this and a solution for this problem because it's a big one, and it's a multi-layered plan. You know, there's a mid-state pension debacle going on right now, and they're all rolled into one. But the miners are the only ones that have basically a piece of legislation that is guaranteed they'd be able to be taken care of, and we would hope that you would be able to give the attention we need to that.
Senator, it's as you know, you, Senator Capito, and I were.
I wanted to thank you for that too, and you still remember that, and you told me you had the picture hanging, so we're very appreciative.
I do, and
you're an official West Virginia now because you've gone down under.
And you know it's a tough job, and they deserve that we work together to address the solution.
Let me just say this: the Mine Health Safety and Health Administration, MSHA as we know it, I'm concerned about some of the proposed rollbacks. I know the funding has been increased, but some of the rollbacks of the safety measures, especially air quality standards, I'm very much concerned about that, sir, because we've come a long way. But let me tell you what really bothers me more than anything. Since the beginning of 2017, 19 miners have died in America, coal miners. 10 of them have been in my state and Senator Capito's state of West Virginia. That's totally unacceptable. It's going the wrong direction. I've been to too many funerals and sat with too many families over the years, and I've experienced myself in my own family. But I introduced the Robert C. Byrd Mine Safety Protection Act with Senator Casey and a few others, and strengthened safety standards, whistleblower protection penalties for bad actors. I don't know if you all have looked at that bill and if you've taken a stand on that bill, and if you would comment if you had.
Senator, I have not looked at that, but I will commit to looking at that bill.
The other thing we have is the dislocated worker grants to help fight opiate epidemic. And you know it's just a horrible tragedy on our country, but it's really, we're ground zero in West Virginia. Because of the heavy lifting, sometimes they're prescribed prescriptions that are very addictive, and it's really destroyed their lives. I don't know if you all have committed, if you've looked at this from the working standpoint. I've fallen down to around 50% or 49% of my working adults that are capable and able of working, actually working. A lot of it's because either addiction or skill sets or a combination of both.
Senator, if I could comment on that, I had the opportunity to visit an opioid treatment center, and one thing that I was struck by is that they did a good job at treating, but they did not integrate that with job opportunities. And so we've announced a little over $20 million in grant opportunities to create pilot programs, and the money, I believe, does come from the dislocated worker. The money does come from, yes, it does come from the dislocated worker grant money to create grant opportunities. Because from my perspective, if you're treating someone and then saying, now you've been treated, go forth, but you don't have a job or a job opportunity, that treatment is not complete.
Right. And
so what I would love to see, and I mentioned this because of the overlap between the appropriations and the authorizing committees, the integration of career education and career opportunities into opioid treatment, I think, is important, and we've been able to allocate $20 million toward that. And I hope that we have greater opportunity to talk about that. That's a very important issue.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just one question very quickly follow up with the special benefits for coal miners program. It's very disturbing because the president's proposed of cutting this is $45 million from special benefits for disabled coal miners. They're going from $69 million down to $24. It's mostly for black lung. And we have people basically right they're at the front lines, if you will. And to have that type of a cut of $45 million into the special benefits, which is mostly used for black lung, and they're having a hard time. If you all are not prepared to answer that, haven't looked into it, maybe we didn't provide you with we'd love to have a follow-up. You've been very, very attentive, and I appreciate that. This is a big one.
Senator, I don't know if that's a discretionary or a mandatory, so I need to look into that. I'm not. Yes, I'll get back to you on that.
Yeah, because we have a rise in, especially young miners going into these mines now. Remember I talked to you about the air quality? Well, if we change the standards of air quality, I can guarantee the black lung disease will continue to increase. This is the only way we had to fight that and try to stop it. But if you can, sir, I just appreciate your attention.
Absolutely, and to just follow up briefly, because there's a misconception out there around the air quality. When in a prior rulemaking, the department committed to engage in an air quality study. That was a pre-existing commitment that goes back several years. And so when the department indicated that it was engaging in that study, that was pursuant to a prior commitment. That is not initiating a new rulemaking process.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry for the extra time.
Thank you to the chairman and the ranking member, and I want to thank the secretary for the visits to West Virginia. And going underground, I think, does really make you realize what a tough job coal mining is. And even with all the mechanization and everything, it's always eye-opening. And I have the same picture hanging in my office too. So it was a good day, and thank you for that. Several of the questions that Senator Manchin asked, I had obviously with MSHA had in mind with the 19 in the last year and a half or year and several months deaths. Can you speak to what you all are doing that may be making changes to when you recognize some of these accidents? I know some of them are vehicular. So what kind of special emphasis are you doing through MSHA to try to alleviate that?
Senator, and if I could, as I see Senator Manchin exiting, I have a quick answer to his question. The reductions are based on workload and not a benefit cut. It's mandatory funding. To the extent that the need exists because it's mandatory, it automatically kicks in. It's mandatory, not discretionary funding. With respect to your question, Senator Capito, and so yes, a number of them are based on vehicular, and we are looking with specificity both on focusing enforcement efforts around that and on whether there are new rules or approaches that we can put into place to address some of those. It has been, in part, we have new miners that haven't been underground before, and so we need to be extra vigilant and extra careful in their education around safety issues. But it may be that we also need to look at some rules or warning signs around those vehicles, and MSHA is looking at that.
Well, certainly technology is leading us into with the push for autonomous vehicles, technology is leading us to all kinds of different cameras and different angles and everything that may be very helpful with that.
And warnings as individuals get within a danger zone of a certain vehicle, correct.
Right. I did want to ask you about apprenticeship, but Senator Murray covered that, and I think you talked about that pretty deeply too. I also want to thank you for, in my reaction to your announcement on the dust rule, you did come to my office to clarify, and I'm glad you clarified that before the committee today. There is no rolling back of the standard of the dust rule that was passed. You're simply deciding when and how to move forward with the study. Is that
is correct. We're fulfilling a commitment made by the department to engage in a study.
Thank you. And also on the associated health plans, long time coming. I'm glad to see that in a regulatory sense you've been able to grasp this one. I think it will have a lot for smaller states, in particular with a lot of small businesses. It's going to have a great impact. I have so these are kind of two kind of off the wall questions that I wanted to ask. One of the things that always troubles me, and particularly when you're looking at it from a budgetary standpoint, is all of the different across many agencies workforce training programs there are. And you address this in your statement, in your written statement, about how you're working with education, for instance, and other departments to try to consolidate and make these workforce training programs more efficient. Could you speak to that briefly?
Senator, this is a very, very important topic, and that's correct. There are between I forget the exact number, there are between 40 and 50 different workforce training programs or workforce education programs we can identify. And I certainly think that there is great need for consolidation. Some have been around for quite a while, and there's need to update them. And others, the apprenticeship program, for example, have great results. And so there's a value to focusing spending on those with great outcomes. Related to that, we've also requested flexibility in the upcoming budget so that governors have discretion to move money around from funding line to funding line. And that's so important. Every governor that I have spoken to on both sides of the aisle would like the flexibility to move funding around. They will say West Virginia is different from Washington and it's different from Missouri, and so our needs are different. And so we would like the flexibility working with the department to reallocate from Program A to Program B to Program C. I have very limited flexibility in giving those types of waivers. And even if we cannot consolidate programs, and I understand that the difficulty of doing that legislatively, providing more discretion on waivers, even if it comes with the report back to Congress on the waivers and why they were granted, I think would empower governors to do what they believe, what he or she believes is best for their state. And I think that's so important.
I have one more question. Thank you. Question, with the tax reform bill that was passed at the end of the year, several private entities have initiated raises in their minimum wage. What kind of role does the department play in terms of monitoring? I know you do enforcement to make sure minimum wage is being executed properly, but are you seeing what are you seeing there in terms of what happened last year? Any changes, and what do you anticipate as we move forward?
Well, Senator, certainly based on data that I've seen, we've had more than 4 million individuals receive bonuses or increases as a result of that congressional action. And one of the reasons that we're asking for additional enforcement action is so we can ensure that as companies, you've got all these great employers that are moving forward and really rewarding their employees and saying we want greater engagement and greater productivity. You've got a few bad actors, and it's important that the bad actors can't free ride. If you let a bad actor get away with something, that hurts all the good employers because it's a lot harder for those good employers to compete. And so my view of enforcement is not, you don't enforce only because there's a bad actor. You also enforce because you need to level the playing field to let all those good actors that are giving all these, wage increases and tax bonuses, the opportunity to compete on an even playing field.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Murray.
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, we are hearing, it's being reported that President Trump is developing a rescission package that would undo the compromise bipartisan budget agreement of 2018 we just passed and he signed into law. Now, the omnibus bill that we implemented was not one I would have written or Senator Blunt would have written. It was hours of negotiated agreement that allowed us to get the votes that we needed to get out of here. So it was bipartisan, and I wanted to ask you, which parts of our bipartisan agreement are you recommending to the President to be undone?
Senator, I'm hearing for exactly what you're hearing from the same sources, which is the media. So at this point, I have received no requests to make any recommendations for any rescissions. Let me comment more generally. The budget process is a process, and those of us that have been through this, even if for only a year, recognize that. And so I recognize I'm here, I'm testifying. You're all going to make the decisions you make, and that's the way the process works.
Well, I appreciate that. And I would just say in general that reneging on an agreement that took us a long time, very hard to get there. If we undo that, it's going to be very hard moving forward for us to be able to know that agreements are agreements and we move on. So I hope we don't go down that road, just for the record. Let me ask you one more question. In 2016, the Obama administration finalized an overtime rule which would have strengthened worker protections to make sure about 13 million workers are paid for the hours they work. As you know, this rule was blocked in court by corporate interests, and last year the Trump administration decided to abandon the workers and the overtime rule. Since that time, it's now been estimated that in my home state alone, we've lost more than $11 million in wages they would have received if the Obama overtime rule had been in place, and by the end of this year, without strong overtime protections, the country workers will lose about an estimated $1.2 billion in wages had the rule been in effect. So it's been 6 months now since the comment period closed on your request for information on a new overtime rulemaking, and I want to ask you what your timeline is and when this is going to be implemented.
Senator, thank you for the question. We're working diligently on this rule. As we've spoken before, we're looking to rewrite it.
What's the timeline on that?
These rules have taken in the past years. My hope is that we are faster than previous administrations, and so I can't commit to a specific timeline other than to say I'm hoping it doesn't take nearly as long as it has in the past.
Which isn't saying much. Okay. Well, a lot of people are waiting. This is a critical rule, and we hope that you urge your department to move quickly on it.
I understand, Senator.
Let me ask, I've got a few questions left. Let me ask one of them while Senator Baldwin gets ready to ask her questions in a moment or two. This is a Bureau of Labor Statistics question. You mentioned the Bureau earlier that you were not involved in trying to manage their numbers, of course, but we would like their numbers to be accurate. So in December of 2017, there was a Wall Street Journal article entitled 25 Cities Adding and Losing the Most Jobs in 2017. That article ran again in USA Today. It listed Cape Girardeau, Missouri as the #1 area in job loss for 2017. Bad enough to hear that if it's true, worse to hear it if it's not true. I'm sure that the Cape Girardeau Chamber President, John Maynor, would like me to be sure and mention today that it wasn't accurate. All of their local information indicated it wasn't accurate, but there really appears to be, to have been at that point at least, no recourse at the Bureau of Labor Statistics to say anything about this. So I think what we found out by March was that the numbers were released and corrected, but clearly a thought is put in people's minds about what's happening to both their local economy and people looking at that economy as a place they might want to move to or might want to invest in. As it turned out, they had job growth, as the local university statistics indicated and their own statistics indicated they did. So I guess the question is, can you tell us what we can do to have more transparency there, to have some recourse if cities want to dispute their data, and what we need to do moving forward to be sure that we don't have people, have communities listed as losing jobs on preliminary statistics when it turns out that they were a community, as that community has for years, that were gaining jobs.
Mr. Chairman, having been someone that sees headlines about the department sometimes and scratches one's head saying, that's contrary to fact. I not only empathize, but fully empathize with the president of the Chamber of Commerce who was put in that situation, and it's a very bad situation to be put in, because once that headline's out there, it's very, very difficult to retract it. I know that that our staff at BLS and yours have discussed this. And one of the issues here is when you have preliminary data, that data as a statistical matter will vary, and while sometimes it's close, sometimes it's not. And I see this often, for example, with the unemployment numbers, where there are revisions, and the revisions will actually show that there was, more employment than we thought, but the headlines never picked that up. One thing that I think is particularly important is, the commissioner for BLS has been pending on the floor, and in having leadership, they've had no confirmed leadership now for several months. And so I would encourage that we move on that commissioner, because with a commissioner in place, it is much easier to look at those types. Are we reporting preliminary data too early? Should we wait a little bit longer to make sure that it is the data and facts? Because what happened in this case, as I'm told, is they reported preliminary data. The media ignored the fact that it's preliminary and just assumed that it was final. By the time the final data was reported, the number was corrected. It was just a statistical variance. But those statistical variances have consequence.
Well, and I think what happened with that statistical variance is they did targeted interviews with specific employers,
right,
who, for whatever reason, those employers had lost jobs, but the community hadn't come close to
correct,
losing jobs. And we all have seen the growth numbers that turn out to be one way or another differently a month later than they were, the economic growth numbers, the unemployment numbers. That has some impact. I think it has more impact if you're talking about a specific community or a specific employer, because there may be some reason to rush preliminary numbers out in a greater context. I really can't imagine what the reason would be, the merit would be to have preliminary numbers that may very well be wrong in a more specific context. That would be my advice on that. And your point is well taken that you need some help over there. And I think we finally, after 11 months on the job, you now have one confirmed nominee that the Senate has, and that's a problem of ours, and we'd accept that. However, this is a problem that was in December of December of last year. It's a fairly recent problem.
It's it is a substantial problem. When it impacts a city, because it's hard for the city to forget that headline. And so one of the difficulties is I am hesitant as secretary to get into the statistical methodology of a statistical agency. And I know you've acknowledged that, but having a confirmed head of BLS, I think, would be helpful.
It would be helpful. This may require a community visit on your part or something, Ms. Secretary. I don't know how they'll be able to recover otherwise. So, Senator Baldwin, followed by Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary Acosta, welcome. In 2016, OSHA issued the OSHA Electronic Injury Reporting Anti-Retaliation Rule. In an attempt to move OSHA into the 21st century, gather more detailed workplace injury data, targeted limited resources to high-hazard industries, and protect workers who report hazards. In your agency's latest regulatory agenda, the Department of Labor announced plans to revise or revoke the parts of, or certain parts of the rule. So, Secretary Acosta, and I'm hoping you can give me a yes or no or short answer since I have so many questions. Do you agree that it's important for OSHA to have access to accurate injury and illness data so as to target limited resources to the most dangerous workplaces? And if data is not informing your priorities, then tell me what is.
I believe that data that can be helpful in targeting enforcement is, in fact, important.
Is the Department of Labor planning to repeal OSHA's electronic injury reporting and anti-retaliation rule?
Senator, briefly, if I could comment. Yes, no answers are sometimes difficult on this. I very much believe that information so that we can target enforcement is important and matters. I also think it's important to respect the privacy of individuals and employees. And so we are looking at methods where we can obtain this data while at the same time respecting the privacy of individuals. We're looking at methods where we can obtain the data in sort of in mass without individual identifying information. Because once we receive the data, it becomes subject to, it can eventually become subject to disclosure. And so the concern around this is not whether we want data on exactly what is happening on a workplace, because I do think data is important, but how we can get that data in an aggregate form without individual identifiable information.
So will you commit then to at least keeping that ability intact?
Senator, it is my wish and desire to, I believe that data is important so we can target enforcement. In my opening statement, I talked about how OSHA enforcement, we've actually had more inspections. And I think that it's not just more inspections, but inspections that are better focused on where injuries are occurring and what types of injuries. And so I do want that data. I want to gather it in a form that respects privacy.
Certainly in other contexts, I know large agencies have been able to anonymize or data. So I would hope this would be a pretty straightforward task.
Unfortunately, it's not. Anonymizing, as Congress has recently found out, is not as straightforward as one may think. But my focus, in the aggregate, this is data that I think is useful and necessary.
Okay. I understand that earlier this week you hosted your third meeting with the Department of Labor's Apprenticeship Task Force. As your department continues to work towards expansion of apprenticeship and work-based learning, it's important that we are engaging small and local businesses, community colleges, as well as the national and local community-based workforce organizations. I am currently working with Senator Isaacson to craft what we're calling the Partners Act. The Partners Act would establish a grant program to support the creation and expansion of industry and sector partnerships to help small and medium-sized businesses develop work-based learning programs and provide mentoring and support services for workers. How would the Department of Labor's plans to spend the fiscal year 19 funding work to support local industry-driven sector partnerships, help businesses expand apprenticeships, and help workers access those opportunities as my partner's bill aims to do? And I will just note before you answer, as soon as we finalize our bill language, I will be making sure you get a copy for input.
Senator, as the ranking member pointed out a little bit earlier, the apprenticeship funding that is currently appropriated under the apprenticeship budget line is focused on registered apprenticeships. For the most part, small businesses do not engage in registered apprenticeships, which is one reason why we are looking to set up a second, a second type of apprenticeship, which is the industry-recognized apprenticeship structure, so that small businesses that are interested in having work-based learning can work with industry associations that could provide guidance, that could provide quality control, that could provide curriculum, and could work with community colleges and sort of push and expand that apprenticeship model to small businesses. So I fully agree with that. Let me also pick up and highlight something that you said that's very important, which is partnerships. Some of the best programs that I have seen are programs where community colleges come together with businesses, often with a little bit of seed money from the department. I'm thinking of a program that I saw in Reno around HVAC. I think it was Truckee Meadows Community College. I'm thinking of Indian Hills Community College in Iowa that actually works with one of our Job Corps, that they're co-located. And it's been and one of the things I've been speaking with the American Association of Community Colleges, Mr. Bumfus, who's their president, about ways that we can support partnerships between community colleges and business. critical to that is I think businesses need to have skin in the game. I think that to have a true partnership, it can't be enough to say we have a business partner. But there should be some type of, whether in-kind or matching contribution or something like that, because then you really are creating a partnership, and where those interests are aligned, I have seen really incredible, and I could share the stories later, but I've seen really incredible success.
Yeah. I have had a chance to have some visits in the state of Wisconsin where I feel I'm seeing very much the same thing, to the great advantage of smaller and medium-sized businesses as well as the participants. And in one case, the apprentice said his only challenge was that all of his coworkers are jealous that he's getting that opportunity and they didn't. Yeah. One other question. Okay,
round
thank
of
you.
questions, Senator Murphy, rather.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Senator
Chairman.
Murray's already asked questions twice, so you can ask yours. But we're not through. We're not necessarily through.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank you and the ranking member for all of the attention that you have given to the issue of mental health funding and conversation we've been having over the last few years around the issue of mental health parity. And that is the subject of the first question that I wanted to ask you about, Mr. Secretary. I want to commend you on comments that you made before President Trump's opioid commission. In that meeting, you mentioned that it would be helpful if the department had additional authority that it does not have currently in law to levy civil monetary penalties for mental health parity violations and the ability to enforce the law on insurance companies. We received, actually, I think, on this subcommittee, I believe, a new report, maybe from about 6 months ago, which detailed the just unjustifiable difference in the way that insurance companies reimburse for opioid and addiction treatment versus how they reimburse for other types of treatment. And everybody who has who's been in an addiction situation can tell you that story very personally. So I raised this issue yesterday at a Health Committee hearing that we had on a package of bills that Senator Murray and Senator Alexander are thinking about putting forward. And I just wanted to ask you to comment on why you think that these new capacities, these new authorities are important to make sure that the industry is in compliance with mental health parity laws.
Well, Senator, thank you for the question. And I did testify at the President's Commission. I think the President's Commission adopted the recommendations. And so we have been tasked with enforcing these mental health parity laws. But we have to, the way we enforce them is against each individual insurance plan. And so if you've got an insurance company with 500 insurance plans, we would have to enforce as against each insurance plan. What we do is we notify the insurance company, and the good insurance companies, of course, would change all their plans to be in accordance. But as sort of someone that thinks of things to some extent from a law enforcement perspective, if you've got one person that has umbrella authority over the content of the various plans, to enforce against each individual plan is a highly inefficient enforcement mechanism. The second point I'd make is the reality is there are always limited resources, and as companies are looking to ensure that benefits are in fact keeping with the law, as a general matter, the presence of a civil penalty tends to focus attention more than the absence of a penalty.
And you don't have that authority under existing law either to look at the insurance company writ large versus the individual plans or to levy civil penalties?
We do not have enforcement as against the insurer.
Right.
And we do not have penalty assessment and authority.
Well, I look forward to working with you and with Senator Murray and Senator Alexander to try to reconcile that, try to fix that for you. Second question is on the interaction and integration that you have with the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense has been given a slug of new resources. They are going to be purchasing a lot more from suppliers and contractors all across the country. that will be happening in Connecticut, where we are going to be asked and are glad to be asked to produce additional undersea capacity for the Navy. And your department has had a long-standing, very important partnership with the Eastern Connecticut Manufacturing Pipeline Initiative, which is a really innovative program in which Electric Boat, the local Workforce Development Board, and the Department of Labor have aligned resources that have resulted in 600 job placements through this pipeline ending up at Electric Boat. And given the fact that Electric Boat's going to be asked to do more, this pipeline now becomes more important than ever, because if we can't find the workers to do this work here in the United States, either we won't deliver the product or we'll be forced to buy more of this stuff overseas, especially the parts that go into the submarine. And I could tell you the same story with respect to jet engines or helicopters. But I would love to have you come at some point and see the very smart investment the Department of Labor has made in the Eastern Workforce Pipeline Initiative. And I just maybe wanted you to comment on how important it is to make sure that all of this new military programming gets done in the United States because we've made investments in workforce.
Senator, I'm a big fan of having it done in the United States, and I'm happy to commit to visit. I try to visit various places, both to learn. I see great partnerships sometimes with community colleges, as I mentioned, Senator Baldwin, and I think it's important to get out there. So I'm happy to commit to that.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Senator Murphy. I have two more questions, and then anybody else that has more, we'll move toward finishing here. So on H-2B visas, once again, the Congress failed to give you and the Department of Homeland Security specific guidance on how to solve this problem. Now, the bill did give you exactly the same guidance you had last time. So two parts of this question are, since the guidance in the new law is exactly the same as it was a year ago, is it necessary to go through another rulemaking process? And the second part of that question is, if it is necessary, how quickly does that start? At a hearing yesterday, the Secretary of Homeland Security said that she was going to reach out to you this week to talk about moving forward sooner rather than later. So what would the answer to those two questions?
Well, Senator, as she said, that she indicated she was going to reach out to me, and now has reached out to me. And I think this is a very frustrating situation for the American people. In private conversations, I urged several senators and several members of the House to come up with a specific number. And one of the concerns that I raised in private conversations is that if there is a discretionary authority, that discretionary authority requires rulemaking. And while we can expedite the rulemaking, it is my, subject to discussion with counsel, but my preliminary view that rulemaking is required. And I think this puts the American people in a really difficult situation, because every year they ask, are we going to get our visas? Are we not going to get our visas? And as difficult as it is to make a decision, I think we owe it to the American people to come up with a number, and that way they know this is the number. They don't have to sit around and wait till April, May, June, or July, by which point some of those visas are no longer of benefit anyhow. There is value in certainty, and certainly I can talk about some suggested reforms. The provisions, the drafts that I saw wouldn't have been the way I would have written them, but they were a compromise, and I think compromises are sometimes better than nothing at all. And so I would encourage this time around Congress to, and I'm happy to even personally work with members to develop some kind of approach where we can bring certainty to this.
Well, I agree with that need for certainty totally. We were moving, I thought, in the right direction to give you some specific things to work with, and then didn't. I would just suggest that you might seek a second legal opinion and see if it's possible, since the situation is exactly where it was a year ago, if that requires a new rule, and if it does require a new rule, whatever could be done to appropriately expedite that until the Congress can do its job, which is tell you what needs to be done here. These are workers that come for less than year-round employment and then return at some point to the country they came from. These are not visas where people come and permanently stay in the United States, and they are critical in some of those short-term employment situations, as you know better than anybody else because of all the requests you get and the effort they have to make to hire people in this country before they can turn to this program and take advantage of it. My last question would be on the 15th of March, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans vacated the fiduciary rule, saying it constituted unreasonableness. I think at that time, the following Monday, your department told CNBC that pending further review, it would not be enforcing the 2016 fiduciary rule. Is that your position still?
Senator, we are not enforcing, pending that court decision, we're not enforcing the rule. We already had an 18-month delay on portions of the rule, but we're not enforcing. We have not yet made a determination as an administration how to proceed on this matter. And if I could go back in the short time I have left to the earlier question around the visas, there's a second issue related to that I want to highlight for the committee that I think is a simple good government matter. The current process for issuing those visas is horribly antiquated. We asked for specific funding to update that process, and it strikes me that irrespective of the difficult decision as to the amount of visas, that the updating of the process is something that everyone should agree on. Under the current computer system, someone applies to the Department of Labor. We review and certify the application. We then actually print out a certification on secure paper, and we send it back to the applicant. The applicant then puts it in the mail and sends it to DHS, that then reviews it and then puts it in the mail and sends it to state. We are at a point where we should have the technology to have someone apply, and much like most of us have on various apps, see where the application is and have it proceed electronically through the process with sort of a database where Americans can see what jobs are available in case Americans want to apply for these jobs. And we've asked for funding now twice to put this project into place. It's a small amount. It gets caught up in the issues around the visa. But I want to highlight it because I just think that this is a good government matter.
Okay. We may want to pursue what the complicating issues are, but we'll look at that carefully, I can assure you. Senator Kennedy, are you ready?
I am, Mr. Chairman. Thanks very much. I'll be brief, Mr. Secretary. I'm sorry I was late. I apologize. And I understand Senator Murr's already asked this question, but I wasn't here, obviously, to hear the answer. Is it possible to quantify the economic costs of sexual harassment?
Senator, I don't think you can quantify the economic costs of. Is it possible is a broad question, but I have no idea how you would do that. I think you could.
Well, we know it has a cost.
It has a cost, but I think to say that the costs are limited to economic costs is an overstatement. There's certainly one could measure economic costs associated with the harassment, but I don't think that those are the only costs of the harassment.
I agree. I absolutely agree with that. But I'm just thinking in terms of breaking it down into bite-sized pieces.
I see.
If you're sexually harassed, it's obviously going to affect your productivity.
Sure.
And is there some way to measure that impact on gross domestic product?
Senator, there may be.
Would you look into that?
Senator, I'm glad to. One of the comments that I made to the ranking member is I am aware of the request. I have shared that with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. One of the areas that I will just sort of mention that I think it's important for someone in my position to be careful about is being overly directive with respect to a statistical agency such as BLS, because there is a value to having a little bit of separation between agencies that gather things like the unemployment data and the Secretary's office. And so while I'm happy to talk about thematics, I think my telling them how to measure something would cross the line.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't want you to do anything inappropriate. I just think it will help the American people understand the issue better. Obviously, money's not everything, but it is a telling statistic. My profession is law, and I remember, for example, 35, 40 years ago, or at least I've read about it. A lot of the larger law firms didn't have women partners or women associates. And then I think some of them changed because it was the right thing to do. Some of them changed, though, because they said, whoa, this is costing us money. You know, we're this bright young law graduate who happens to be a woman is smarter than any of her colleagues and works harder. So maybe we ought to. We ran the numbers, and we've been born again. Now, I'm not saying that was always the case, but I think it did happen. Let me ask you another quick question. Labor participation rate. Certainly the unemployment rate is important, but in my state, our unemployment rate has come down like everyone else's. We're still higher than most states, but our labor participation rate is dismal. What can we do about that?
Senator, this this is an issue that has baffled a lot of folks. You've got 4.5% unemployment rate in your state, but if it's similar to the rest of the nation, the labor participation rate is probably somewhere in the low 60s.
It's actually, I think our labor force participation rate's actually lower than that. It's an embarrassingly low figure. And
so there are a few issues behind it, and they're worth sort of discussing and breaking down. First, the population as a whole is aging. It peaked somewhere around 15 years ago, and if you look at the labor force participation rate of what's called prime age, the 25 to 54, it's much higher than the 55 and above, and so there's been a just under 10% shift from prime age to 55 and above. That may impact some states more than others, and that's certainly part of labor force participation. A second really important part of labor force participation has to do with younger Americans. And, there was a time when we measured college graduation in 4 years, and now we're measuring college graduation in 6 years.
That's a good point.
And I think that we need to have a discussion as a nation about is higher education doing what it should to ensure that folks aren't just lifelong learners but lifelong earners. And so I like to say when I talk about this, have individuals been to a study abroad, or do they know someone that has been to a study abroad? If they do, would it make sense to have, for a criminology major, a study at a police academy for a semester, or for someone who's pre-law to spend a semester working at a law firm, so that they learn not just theory but life skills? And I also think that would lead to, if someone knew that upon graduation they had a job as a police officer or as a legal assistant or something else waiting for them, they might graduate sooner and faster. The labor force participation rate among young Americans has declined by a level of magnitude. And thirdly, I would just cite the opioid crisis. I believe it was under President Obama, BLS did a survey, and they asked adult men not working in the labor force, adult men not in the labor force that were prime age 25 to 54, did you take a painkiller yesterday? And 44% said yes.
Oh, my God.
Now,
could you repeat that?
Adult men not in between 25 and 54, not in the labor force. I'm happy to provide the senator with the data.
I'm like-
And I believe 44, I'm working off memory, 44% said yes. Then I believe an individual who, I'm blanking on the name now, who's a professor at Princeton. He was one of President Obama's economic advisors, and I'm citing the prior administration to show the bipartisanship of this issue. Followed up by saying, with a subset of that study, Professor Krieger, with the subset of the data was the painkiller an opioid, and 31% said yes. So that's not last month or last week, but that's yesterday. And I do think that some states are harder hit by this issue. So when you have 31% of men not working between the ages of 25 and 54 saying they took an opioid yesterday, I think that sort of highlights a third issue with that labor force participation that I think is important, which is why.
Well, I'm out of time, Mr. Secretary, but I really do appreciate it, and if you could send me that's breathtaking.
We will do that.
I'm sorry I went over, Mr. Chairman.
Interesting question and a very interesting answer. Both of the young people in the workforce and people who are outside the workforce, those are both statistics that go a long way toward explaining some of these numbers that we have a hard time wrapping our mind around, I think. Senator Baldwin, do you have another?
I do.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to just wrap up the question I was asking before, or at least clarify something on the apprenticeships, and then ask you a question about trade adjustment assistance. You were talking about the current grant programs for registered apprenticeships, and then providing more opportunities for small and medium-sized businesses moving for industry recognition. And I just wanted to emphasize that one of the things I'm looking at is making it easier for small and medium-sized manufacturers and businesses to work in partnership for the primary apprenticeship, which would be a registered apprenticeship.
That's fair. Thank you, Senator.
Okay, on trade adjustment assistance. Secretary, the Department of Labor has certified that at least 25,000 Wisconsin workers have lost their job due to NAFTA. The same number of workers have received vital job training supports through the Department of Labor's Trade Adjustment Assistance Program. And this training helps workers build new skills and get back into the workforce as soon as possible. The President's budget includes a proposal to refocus the TAA program on apprenticeships, what we were just talking about. Yet the legislative change results, as I read it, in a $1.7 billion cut to the TAA program. Wisconsin workers, manufacturers, and farmers are all concerned about this administration's trade strategy and how it might cost them jobs, depending on how these things play out. And given this concern, how can you justify cutting the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, which has helped so many Wisconsin workers retrain after losing a job?
So, Senator, thank you for the question. Let me try to break that apart into a few questions, because I don't think it's as portrayed, but I will try to explain that. So the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, I think, is very important and is really intended to help individuals who lose jobs because of something like NAFTA. If you look at the data, less than half of individuals that receive TAA receive actual training, and effectively zero. I think 369 out of more than 57,000 receive on-the-job training. And so it is our hope and intent, if approved, to focus the TAA program on-the-job training. The TAA jobs particularly involved sometimes older workers or second career workers that aren't looking to go back to sit in a classroom, that aren't looking for online, and sort of apprenticeships or on-the-job training or others we believe is the best way to address their needs. This, I believe, this is a mandatory spending line, correct? So this is a mandatory spending line. So because it's mandatory, once someone is certified, the money is spent. Congress is not appropriating it year to year. The budget estimates, and this is an OMB and a CBO issue, that because of the greater success, the overall impact on the budget will go down by the amount that you specified because of savings in unemployment insurance, because people are going to go back to work that much sooner. So it is not a cut in the benefit, but it is a reduction in the budget because of greater success in the program. Did that make sense?
It did. I may want to follow up with you on more detail just to see how OMB approached that. One additional question: you noted that TAA comes into effect when something like NAFTA, I think I'm quoting you, is at play. Given all of the trade-related tariff discussions that are going on right now, do you believe you have the authority to use TAA to retrain workers who may in the future lose their jobs due to tariff retaliation, for example?
Senator, I said something like NAFTA because TAA is a very complicated program and statute. And while as a general matter you need a free trade agreement or an agreement in play, it's not quite that simple. And so when an individual loses their job because of tariff or trade, it's really a fact-bound determination. So, for example, with respect to the recent solar panel tariffs, I believe we haven't we provided about 400, I apologize, 437 individuals with TAA rising from the solar panel tariffs that were recently imposed. What I will commit to the Senator is this: to the extent I do not have authority under TAA, we also have access to the dislocated worker monies, and so states could apply for dislocated worker funds, and I certainly would want to use my discretion to use those funds where TAA is not available.
Well, given that I'm a glass half full person, so I'm hearing some interest in
I want to help
this work.
Yes.
And so if you would keep in touch, especially over the next few weeks and months, as a lot of things are playing out at once, on your whether you believe you have authority without change of law, and then let the committee know if there are further tools that need to come under the consideration of this committee. That would be helpful.
I will do so, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Secretary, is there a topic we haven't brought up, or do you have anything you want to say in your final comments before we gavel out here?
Yes, I would like to take a minute to address, just give me 1 second here. I'd like to take a minute to address an issue, and it's an issue that has a good story at the end, but I haven't talked about it, in part because I do think it's important that that we proceed with care, but it has to do with I thought the bipartisan outcome that we got on the chip credit. And I couldn't help but notice that there were stories about whether we did a quantitative versus a qualitative analysis. And as I mentioned to some senators privately, my predecessor, when the rule was written in 2011, did a qualitative analysis. And we did the exact same thing, yet there was no outcry at the time in 2011. And so I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about the data that we have and just put it on the record. And so here's what we know. We know that total wages paid to bartenders and waitstaff in the United States is about $81 billion. We know that the portion of these wages, and this is all public data, we know that the portion of these wages that go to tipped employees is about $29 billion. And we know that of this $29 billion, about $15 to $16 billion is the amount of wages required by the relevant minimum wage laws. And so we know that there are about $13 to $14 billion that remains. And that's a big pot, and that's composed of a lot of things. That's composed of wages paid in addition to or and above the relevant minimum wage. It's composed of wages paid for overtime, wages paid for commission, and wages paid for tips. And that's pretty much all that we know in terms of data. And so to measure economic transfers related to employers keeping tips, to the extent employers would keep tips, we need to make a series of assumptions, the most significant which include what percent of this amount is due to tips, as opposed to overtime or commissions or wages paid in addition to minimum wage, what percent of this amount is earned in localities or states that do not allow tip pools, and there are several. What would customer behavior do if customers found out that any establishment would keep a tip? Personally, I think customers would be pretty furious and would make that known. And what would restaurants in fact do? Would restaurants in fact keep tips? And we have little to no data on these questions. And so, for example, we could assume that the overtime paid to all employees that actually get tips in the United States is zero. I think that's a pretty unrealistic assumption. That about a third of the nation's tipped employees work in locations that prohibit tip pools. That could be a guess. That no customer would object to a restaurant's keeping tips in a way that would impact their behavior, the amount of tips that they give, or the desire to frequent that establishment. I think that's a very unrealistic assumption because customers would, in fact, be pretty upset, and that no employee would respond to a restaurant's keeping tips by quitting, by working fewer hours, by working less efficiently. And I think that's also a crazy assumption because I think employees would be pretty upset. And in this era of tight labor markets, most of them would walk. Now, if we made these wildly crazy assumptions, we could come up with a number. And that number would be somewhere upwards of about 600 million. But those are one set of assumptions, and depending on the assumptions that you make, you could go anywhere from 0 to 13 billion. One group that commented offered a range of 523 million to 13.2 billion. And so my point is this. When we write rules, I think it's important that the analysis should be relevant, based on realistic assumptions, and helpful to the public. It should not be a check-the-box exercise. And qualitative analysis in an NPRM is used often. And so, and in fact was used in writing the initial 2011 rule. And so while no one on this committee made comments, I couldn't help but notice that there were public comments made about this, and that those same public comments were not made in 2011. And I think that is indicative of an unfortunate state of affairs that we're at. But that's why I'm really glad that we had a happy ending, because from my perspective, I didn't think employers would keep tips. I think that's a nasty thing to do. I think people would walk. I think customers would leave. I think they would lose wait staff. And so making it unlawful is perfectly fine because it should be. From the perspective of others, they thought employers may keep tips. And so making it unlawful was also a good thing. From my perspective, there are a lot of hardworking people in the back of the house that really deserve to be part of that tip pool. The cooks, the dishwashers, the folks that make sure that the food arrives warm on clean dishes. And so the trade-off between, having a tip pool that shares between the front of the house and the back of the house in return for just, making sure, as a matter of law saying employers cannot keep tips, I think it is kind of win-win. And I just wanted to thank the ranking member, to thank the chairman, to thank leadership on both sides, and just say, look, if we can communicate, I think sometimes there are solutions. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you for your answers and your time today and your leadership at the department. The record will stay open for 1 week for additional questions, and the subcommittee hearing's adjourned.